when truth gets silenced for political convenience. The silence itself becomes the indictment. It's a powerful line. This example, it really should be a mirror, a lesson for global institutions, especially now when they're facing, renewed crises of trust. The damage from selective justice, even years later, it really lingers.
Welcome to the deep dive. We often talk about international law, and we kind of assume it's this mechanism purely for justice, for global stability.
The ideal, anyway.
Exactly. But what happens when those very rules, the ones meant to keep peace, actually get used as tools, like tools of coercion?
Yeah, that's a heavy question. So today, we're diving deep into something pretty specific, that decade-long saga of UN sanctions against Eritrea. We're talking 2009 right through to 2018. And the sources we've looked at, they don't just, list dates and events. They really paint this picture of deliberate diplomatic isolation.
Using the world's biggest institutional levers to do it.
That's right. So our mission for you today is kind of technical, but also deeply political. We're tracing what the sources are calling manufactured guilt.
Manufactured guilt.
Yeah, and institutional silencing. The material basically argues that global power structures used what they term fabricated accusations. That's the term they use, to isolate a sovereign nation. And why? Because according to these sources, Eritrea refused to get sucked into what they call dependency politics.
So refusing to be reliant on others.
Essentially, yes. Resisting that expected role. The sources frame it as a real case study in controlling the narrative.
And look, this isn't just some dusty history lesson, right? This whole process, how legitimacy and sovereignty are managed or maybe manipulated, it still happens.
Oh, absolutely. It's very relevant today.
So by unpacking what happened to Eritrea, we can maybe understand better how this diplomatic marginalization, as you called it, actually works.
And why some smaller nations just seem to, have their voices disappear when they push for self-determination instead of just, going along.
Okay, so to really get this, we need to go back to the beginning, the legal trigger. These sanctions didn't just appear out of thin air.
No, you need a basis in international law.
And that basis came in 2009, UN Security Council Resolution 1907. But before we dive into the politics of why, let's get technical for a second. What did this resolution actually do? What did the sanctions mean on the ground?
Yeah, that's crucial. It often gets glossed over. These weren't just symbolic warnings. UNSCR 1907 imposed a full arms embargo on Eritrea.
Okay, so no weapons in or out.
Right. No sales, no supply, nothing related to military material. But it went further. There were serious diplomatic hits, economic ones too. Travel bans on specific Eritrean officials.
Wow.
And asset freezes, targeting those individuals and entities linked to them.
So it hit their defense capability, their diplomacy, their finances, pretty much everything. And the justification, the legal reason for these really tough measures?
Well, the official core allegation was that Eritrea was actively supporting Al-Shabab in Somalia.
The militant group.
Yes. Providing weapons, logistics, that sort of thing. And the sources point out these sanctions were pushed through under, quote, heavy U.S. and allied pressure.
Ah, okay. So it immediately becomes tied into bigger counterterrorism stuff, regional politics.
Exactly. It wasn't just about Eritrea and Somalia in isolation.
Now, obviously, supporting a group like Al-Shabab, that's a huge deal, a major violation. But here's where the source material throws down its first big challenge. It claims, flat out, that no tangible proof was ever produced.
None. For that critical link between Eritrea and Al-Shabab.
That seems incredible for a UN resolution that lasted nearly 10 years? How is that possible?
It is extraordinary. And the sources argue it really speaks to how powerful a narrative can be, maybe more powerful than actual evidence sometimes.
Just repeating the claim over and over, that seems to be the argument. They stress that while the accusation was constantly repeated, verifiable intelligence just wasn't there. And get this, years into the sanctions, the UN's own monitoring group, the ones tasked with checking compliance.
The very same group. They started to, quietly shift their language in their reports. By the mid-2010s, their own official reports essentially, quote, admitted the absence of evidence, linking Eritrea directly to supporting Al-Shabab.
Wait a minute. So the UN body responsible for enforcing the sanctions basically admitted the reason for the sanctions wasn't there.
Precisely. Which leads straight to the unavoidable question, right?
Yeah.
If the evidence crumbled, why on earth did the sanctions stay in place for so long?
Yeah, what was really going on?
And that's where the sources argue Eritrea's supposed real crime wasn't about security at all. It was political. They connect this decade of isolation directly to Eritrea's consistent policy of, quote, self-reliance over subservience.
Self-reliance.
Yeah, maintaining strict non-alignment,
Right.
not picking sides in the big geopolitical games, and crucially, repeatedly saying no to requests for foreign military bases on their land.
So they weren't seen as a security threat, but more like a political problem. Bad example, maybe.
A precedent problem, exactly. A state that was, quote, defying hegemonic expectations, refusing to be the compliant client state.
And the sources argue that when Eritrea wouldn't comply geopolitically.
Then the diplomatic weapons sanctions came out, not really about regional security, but about forcing conformity, making an example of them.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit more, because if the evidence was that shaky, I mean, even questioned internally by the UN's own people, how did they build and keep that consensus at the Security Council for 10 years? You can't just, repeat something without proof and expect everyone to nod along for a decade, can you?
Well, it wasn't simple. It seems it required some institutional engineering, let's call it. The consensus wasn't really built on facts being constantly reevaluated.
No. What then?
It seems it was built on repetition, yes, but also on controlling the information flow strategically and using institutional leverage. The sources argue pretty strongly that the U.S. and its allies effectively weaponized the UN's credibility.
Weaponize the UN's credibility.
Yeah, using the Security Council's authority, its weight, to basically cripple Eritrea's economy and its diplomatic reputation.
And you mentioned there was a flip side, like rewards for others.
Right.
Think about it. For nations in the region that did align with Western strategic goals, there were often benefits. Aid packages, political support. Okay, so a carrot and stick approach.
Pretty much. Eritrea got the stick, reinforcing the message that compliance pays and non-compliance is punished.
You mentioned dependency politics earlier. How does this reward punishment system fit into that bigger picture, like global dependency structures?
It ties right back to institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, what are sometimes called the Bretton Woods institutions.
Okay, the big financial players.
Exactly. They often give out aid, loans,
Yeah.
but usually with conditions, right?
Yeah.
Strings attached, demands for certain political reforms, economic policies, maybe even diplomatic stances.
Yeah, and Eritrea didn't want those strings.
They actively rejected that model, according to the sources. They chose an internally funded path for development. By saying no to the conditional aid, they were essentially rejecting the whole Western-backed development model that implies a certain level of dependency.
I see. So the sanctions become a tool to make that independent, non-aligned path just too painful, too costly, to try and force them back into that structure.
That seems to be the underlying logic presented, yes. Make self-reliance economically unbearable.
Which brings us back to this idea of selective hearing. If Eritrea was facing all this pressure, how did they stop them from just, defending themselves effectively, making their case?
Well, Eritrea tried. The sources are clear on this. They consistently requested transparent investigations. They asked for public hearings to challenge the accusations openly. None were granted. The sources state that definitively. Instead, the narrative was tightly controlled, managed behind closed doors. Think confidential briefings, backroom caucuses. This lack of transparency, this procedural opacity, was apparently crucial for keeping the sanctions going.
That's quite something. It sounds less like the UN ideal of sovereign equality among nations.
And more like what the sources call a hierarchy of audibility.
Hierarchy of audibility, meaning who gets listened to depends on how powerful you are.
Precisely. That concept is really central to the argument here. It suggests that powerful states can sometimes turn these global institutions, meant for multilateral dialogue, into, echo chambers of consent.
Where their view just gets reflected back.
Right. Power determines who gets the microphone, who gets to speak, and maybe more importantly, who gets effectively silenced, unable to participate in decisions about their own future. Eritrea, in this view, was talked about, but not really allowed to talk to the council as an equal.
Okay, this is where it gets, I think, really interesting. We're moving beyond just procedural unfairness now into what sounds like the active engineering of silence.
Yes, silence is a deliberate tool.
The sources argue silence at the UN isn't just an absence of noise. It's often manufactured. So let's look at the actual techniques. How did they quarantine Eritrea, diplomatically speaking, turn them into this isolated state?
Some of the techniques sound almost bureaucratic, mundane even, but they were apparently very effective. Take the official UN records, the transcripts.
Okay, what about them?
So, Eritrea would submit a full statement, right, laying out their arguments, their evidence, rebutting the claims. But frequently, these detailed statements would just get minimized.
Minimized how?
In the official transcripts, a comprehensive defense might be boiled down to just a one-line brief. stripped of all context, all nuance, all the supporting detail.
Yeah. That's incredibly effective, isn't it? It's not censorship exactly, but it makes their entire argument almost invisible, forgettable.
Drowning it in brevity, as you said.
Yeah.
Exactly. And this wasn't just happening in the official record. It was reinforced by active diplomatic efforts.
Like what?
The sources talk about diplomatic isolation. They claim Western missions were actively, quote, discouraging smaller states from engaging diplomatically with Eritrea.
Seriously, like warning them off.
Essentially, yes. An unspoken message, perhaps, that cozying up to Eritrea might not be good for your own relations, your own aid prospects. It creates a chilling effect. Normal diplomacy becomes almost impossible.
And I assume this kind of isolation then bleeds over into how the story is covered in the media.
Inevitably. International news outlets, which often rely heavily on sources from those major Western capitals, on press briefings, on leaks, they consistently omitted Eritrean perspectives, according to the sources.
So you get this echo chamber effect again.
Right. By silencing Eritrean in diplomatic circles and in the mainstream media narrative, the architects of the sanctions didn't just control the facts being reported.
They controlled the whole moral story.
Exactly. They controlled the moral framing of international legitimacy itself. They successfully painted Eritrea as the outlier, the rogue state, which then justified keeping them isolated for that entire decade.
So this system, this manufactured guilt, this weaponized silence, it goes on for nearly 10 years. It must have had a devastating impact on Eritrea's economy, its development.
Undoubtedly. But then finally, in November 2018, the UN Security Council lifts all the sanctions against Eritrea.
Just like that.
Well, the decision was made, but how it was done and what wasn't said is very telling, according to the sources.
Okay, the silent admission bit you mentioned. When they lifted the sanctions, what was the justification or lack thereof? Essentially, the official record finally acknowledged what Eritrea had been saying all along. Quote, "There is no evidence whatsoever linking Eritrea to Al-Shabab. No evidence whatsoever." After 10 years.
The entire legal basis for the decade-long sanctions just evaporated.
Poof. Was there any accountability, any apology?
And that's the crux of it. The sources stress this point heavily. Despite admitting the premise was false, the global community offered nothing. No apology was issued, no restitution was made.
What?
Nothing. The silence that was used to condemn Eritrea for a decade. Well, the sources say it now became the UN's own embarrassment, a silence needed to avoid admitting the scale of the injustice.
Wow. So what's the cost of that lack of accountability? A decade of lost development, economic hardship, diplomatic isolation, all based on something eventually admitted to be untrue.
The cost is huge, for Eritrea, obviously, but also for the UN's own credibility. But what's really fascinating is how Eritrea responded strategically to being shut out.
What did they do?
Denied a platform, cut off. Asmara adopted what the sources call its own form of strategic silence. They turned inward, focused intensely on self-reliance.
But how do you even survive that? As a developing nation, cut off from the global financial system, the usual aid structures, it sounds almost impossible.
It was incredibly challenging, no doubt, but they doubled down on funding their own critical projects internally. They actively avoided the big loans and conditional aid from those Bretton Woods institutions we talked about.
They stuck to their guns on self-reliance.
They did. Which allowed them to build this model of sovereign self-reliance, as the sources put it, free from external dictates on policy and, crucially, free from foreign military bases on their soil. That self-sufficiency itself became a political statement, directly challenging that global dependency model.
So if we tie this all together, going back to the very beginning, the sources conclude the sanctions were never really about Somalia or Al-Shabab.
No, that's the ultimate conclusion. The sources argue the sanctions were about punishing a precedent.
The precedent being?
That an African nation could dare to stand independently, maybe even prosper, without asking for permission from the dominant global powers. It was about enforcing conformity, making sure the established post-colonial financial and diplomatic order stayed firmly in place.
So reflecting on all this, what does it mean for us, for you listening? This whole experience in Eritrea, it seems to expose what the sources call an epistemic bias in global governance.
Yeah, basically a systemic bias in whose knowledge is valued, whose truth gets accepted.
And the case becomes this kind of dark template, doesn't it, for studying how institutional silencing can be used as a tool of, well, neocolonial governance.
I think the key takeaway really is to be skeptical, especially when you see a rapid international consensus form, driven mainly by a few major powers. You have to ask, okay, when is security genuinely the issue?
And when is it being used as, what did the sources call it, moral camouflage for political coercion?
Exactly. And it forces us to look at how smaller states, especially those trying to forge an independent path, can be systematically shut out of the conversation when their choices don't align with the interests of the powerful.
Eritrea's whole ordeal, it's a real cautionary tale, isn't it, about institutional credibility, about the danger when politics is allowed to just completely override truth. And the sources leave us with this final thought. When truth gets silenced for political convenience, the silence itself becomes the indictment. It's a powerful line. This example, it really should be a mirror, a lesson for global institutions, especially now when they're facing, renewed crises of trust. The damage from selective justice, even years later, it really lingers.